What if I told you that everything you learned about the Civil War was only half the truth? That behind the battles and speeches, there were hidden conspiracies, betrayals, and horrifying secrets that history books never revealed. Stay with me, because once you hear these secrets, you'll never see American history the same way again. The American Civil War is often described as a fight between the North and the South, between freedom and slavery. This is the version we've all been taught, the heroic battle to end human suffering, to unite a broken nation. But the truth is, history is rarely that simple. Beneath the surface, this war was far more complex, far more brutal, and far more corrupt than what textbooks ever revealed. There were secrets buried so deep that even today, most Americans don't know the full story. The war officially began in April 1861, when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. But in reality, the tensions had been building for decades. The North and South had been growing apart, not just in terms of slavery, but in economics, politics, and ideology. The South depended on agriculture, its economy built on cotton and slavery. The North, however, was industrializing rapidly, creating powerful factories, railroads, and financial institutions. Both sides had something to lose, and neither was willing to back down. But here's the first secret that history books rarely mention. This war wasn't just about slavery. It was about control, power, economic dominance. The Southern states feared that the North would use its growing wealth and influence to crush them. The Northern elite, on the other hand, saw an opportunity to reshape the country in their vision, one where industrialization ruled and Southern plantations no longer held power. It wasn't just a war of ideals, it was a war over who would control America's future. And what about Abraham Lincoln? He is celebrated as the man who freed the slaves, but few people know that he didn't always plan to. In fact, in his early presidency, Lincoln's main goal wasn't to end slavery, it was simply to preserve the Union. He was willing to allow slavery to continue in certain states if it meant keeping the country together. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, is often seen as a moral declaration, but in reality it was a strategic move designed to weaken the South's economy and prevent European nations like Britain and France from supporting the Confederacy. It was less about morality and more about war tactics. Meanwhile, hidden from the public eye, both the Union and the Confederacy were engaging in secret dealings, espionage, and backdoor negotiations that would make modern politics look tame. Wealthy businessmen and bankers, some even from Europe, were profiting from the war, quietly funding both sides, ensuring that no matter who won, they would remain powerful. The common soldiers fought and died on the battlefield, believing they were fighting for a noble cause, but behind closed doors, the war was just another way for the elite to strengthen their hold on America. This is just the beginning of the untold history of the Civil War. What if I told you that spies walked freely in the White House, that Lincoln himself was surrounded by people he couldn't trust? What if I told you that some of the war's greatest betrayals came from within? In the next section, we will uncover the hidden world of espionage, secret alliances, and the double agents who changed the course of history, without most Americans ever knowing. Stay with me, because the truth is far darker than you've ever imagined. For most people, the Civil War was a battle between two opposing ideologies, one fighting to end slavery, the other fighting to preserve it. But behind the smoke of war, there was another battle taking place, one that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with money, power, and control. Wars are expensive. They require weapons, supplies, transportation, and armies to keep fighting. The Civil War was no different. But the real question is, who was paying for it? And more importantly, who was profiting from it? Most people assume that the Union, being wealthier and more industrialized, had the upper hand from the beginning. But what many don't know is that the Northern war machine depended heavily on private investors, European bankers, and powerful businessmen who had their own interests in the outcome. War was good for business, and many of the most powerful men in America saw the conflict as an opportunity rather than a crisis. Take the railroad industry, for example. At the time, the government was pouring money into expanding the railways to transport troops and supplies. Private companies seized this chance to secure lucrative contracts, often charging inflated prices for services that the military had no choice but to accept. Corruption ran deep. Politicians were bribed, businessmen became overnight millionaires. While thousands of soldiers died on the battlefield, these war profiteers were lining their pockets with blood money. And then there were the European bankers, particularly from Britain and France. They had a vested interest in the war, and some of them secretly funded both sides, not out of loyalty but out of strategy. By keeping the war going, they ensured that America remained divided and economically weak, preventing it from becoming a major global power too soon. One of the biggest players, the powerful banking family known as the Rothschilds, who had financial ties to both the Union and the Confederacy. Their goal was simple: keep America in debt and dependent on foreign financial institutions. Even Abraham Lincoln recognized the danger of allowing private banks to control war financing. In fact, one of his boldest moves was introducing the greenback dollar, a government-issued currency that bypassed private banks entirely. But this decision made him powerful enemies, including some within his own government. Some historians believe that this financial battle played a role in his eventual assassination, but that's a story for later. And what about the South? The Confederacy, despite its strong agricultural economy, was struggling to fund its war efforts. With little industrial support and no central banking system, it had to rely on loans from wealthy plantation owners and European backers. But the problem was, many of these investors demanded something in return: land, influence, and future trade agreements that would benefit them long after the war ended. So, was the Civil War truly fought over ideals? Or was it a carefully orchestrated struggle for economic dominance, where both sides were manipulated by a handful of powerful individuals pulling the strings from behind the scenes? One thing is clear: this war wasn't just about soldiers fighting on battlefields. It was also about secret deals, corruption, and financial warfare. And while most history books focus on the generals and the battles, they rarely talk about the real power players, the businessmen and bankers who shaped the outcome of the war without ever stepping onto a battlefield. But money wasn't the only weapon used in this war. There was another battlefield, one that few people knew about. A hidden war of spies, double agents, and betrayals. In the next section, we uncover the secret intelligence networks that operated during the Civil War, revealing the spies who changed history in ways you've never been told. Stay with me, because the truth is only getting darker. Wars are not just fought on battlefields. Some of the most critical battles take place in the shadows, where whispered secrets are more dangerous than bullets, and a single betrayal can change the course of history. The American Civil War was no exception. While soldiers clashed on the front lines, another war was unfolding, a war of espionage, deception, and double agents operating in the heart of both the Union and the Confederacy. The Union and Confederate governments knew that whoever controlled information would have the upper hand. Both sides built extensive spy networks to infiltrate enemy lines, gather intelligence, and manipulate the course of the war. Some of these spies became legends, while others remained hidden, their contributions buried by history. One of the most effective Union spies was Elizabeth Van Lew, a wealthy Southern woman from Richmond, Virginia. On the surface, she appeared to be a loyal Confederate supporter, but in reality, she despised slavery and secretly worked for the Union. She ran a vast spy network, smuggling messages in hollowed-out eggs and using codes hidden inside books. Even more astonishing, she placed one of her former enslaved workers, Mary Bowser, inside the Confederate White House as a servant. Bowser had an almost photographic memory and would listen to high-ranking Confederate officials discuss war strategies, later passing this intelligence to the Union. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, had no idea that one of his own household staff was feeding critical information to the enemy. But the Confederates had their own spies, one of the most dangerous being Rose O'Neal Greenhow. A high society woman in Washington, D.C., she used her charm and influence to extract secrets from Union politicians, military officers, and government officials. Greenhow's intelligence was so valuable that it helped the Confederacy win the First Battle of Bull Run, one of the early victories of the war. She was eventually caught and imprisoned, but even behind bars, she continued sending messages to the South using coded letters hidden in the seams of her dresses. Then there were the double agents, playing both sides for their own gain. One of the most mysterious figures was John Wilkes Booth. Yes, the same man who would later assassinate Lincoln. Many believe he was more than just a Southern sympathizer. Some theories suggest he was deeply involved in Confederate espionage operations long before the assassination. Booth moved through secret Confederate networks, possibly gathering intelligence and coordinating with spies. Was his final act, Lincoln's assassination, part of a larger Confederate plot? Or was he working under the influence of others who wanted Lincoln gone? And then there's the biggest mystery of all, the spies who operated inside Lincoln's own government. Lincoln was aware that his administration had been infiltrated, but the problem was, he didn't know who he could trust. Some of his closest advisors may have been feeding information to the enemy. Even his own Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, was suspected by some of being involved in a plot against Lincoln. But was he a traitor, or just a man playing a dangerous political game? What's clear is that the Civil War wasn't just a battle of soldiers and cannons. It was a war of hidden messages, secret codes, and invisible battles fought in the corridors of power. And if spies could move so freely, influencing war strategies and even assassinations, it raises an even darker question. Was the outcome of the war truly decided on the battlefield, or was it carefully manipulated by unseen hands? But if you think the hidden war ended with espionage, you're mistaken. There were crimes so brutal, so horrifying, that even today history tries to erase them. In the next section, we will uncover the forgotten war crimes that both sides committed, the dark truth that history books refuse to tell. Stay with me, because the secrets are only getting darker. History is written by the victors, and when a war ends, the horrors committed by both sides are often buried, erased from textbooks, hidden beneath patriotic speeches, and rewritten to fit a more acceptable narrative. The Civil War was no exception. While it is remembered as a fight for unity and freedom, the truth is far more disturbing. Both the Union and the Confederacy committed atrocities, war crimes so brutal that they were deliberately forgotten. One of the darkest secrets of the war was the treatment of prisoners of war, POWs. Thousands of captured soldiers were sent to prison camps, but these weren't just ordinary jails. They were death traps. The most notorious of them all was Andersonville, a Confederate-run prison camp in Georgia. It was designed to hold 10,000 prisoners, but at its peak, over 33,000 Union soldiers were crammed inside. There were no proper shelters, food was scarce, and disease spread like wildfire. In just over a year, nearly 13,000 Union prisoners died, not from battle wounds, but from starvation, disease, and neglect. But the Union wasn't innocent either. In retaliation, the North operated its own brutal prison camps. Camp Douglas in Chicago became known as the Andersonville of the North. It held thousands of Confederate prisoners in freezing conditions with little food, contaminated water, and rampant disease. Some reports suggest that Union guards even executed prisoners for sport. These camps weren't about justice, they were about revenge. And then there were the massacres, slaughters of soldiers and civilians that defied any rules of war. One of the most horrific was the Fort Pillow massacre in 1864. A group of African-American Union soldiers had surrendered to Confederate forces, expecting to be taken as prisoners of war. But instead of mercy, they were executed, shot, stabbed, and burned alive. The Confederates showed no remorse. To them, black soldiers fighting for the Union were traitors to their race, and they didn't deserve to live. But war crimes didn't just happen on the battlefield. There were hidden political purges where suspected Confederate sympathizers were imprisoned without trial. There were secret executions where Union and Confederate leaders eliminated enemies within their own ranks. And then there was the deliberate destruction of entire cities, justified as military strategy, but often meant as punishment. The most infamous example was Sherman's March to the Sea, where Union General William Tecumseh Sherman ordered the burning of farms, homes, and entire towns across Georgia. Thousands of civilians, many of whom had nothing to do with the war, were left homeless, starving, and broken. But perhaps the greatest crime of all was what happened after the war ended. When the war was over, people thought justice would be served, but instead, many of the wealthiest war profiteers, corrupt politicians, and high-ranking military leaders walked free. The powerful banking families that funded the war grew richer, while the soldiers who fought and died were left with nothing. Former enslaved people were promised freedom, but in many cases, they were forced into a new form of slavery, sharecropping, where they remained in debt and under white control for generations. And the biggest question of all, was Lincoln's assassination truly the act of one man, or was it part of something much larger? John Wilkes Booth may have pulled the trigger, but his connections to Confederate spies, Southern elites, and even international bankers suggest that the assassination wasn't just about revenge. It was about control. Some believe Booth was part of a broader conspiracy to ensure that the post-war America would be shaped by powerful forces behind the scenes, not by Lincoln's vision of unity. So now, as we look back at the Civil War, we must ask ourselves, how much of what we've been taught is the truth, and how much has been carefully rewritten to protect those in power? The war was not just about North versus South. It was about money, power, betrayal, and secret agendas that shaped the future of the United States in ways we're only beginning to understand. History books may tell us one version of events, but the darkest secrets of the Civil War remain buried, hidden in lost documents, erased from records, and whispered only in forgotten corners of history.